There were no headlines, no sirens, no witnesses. That night, Elvis Presley almost died, and no one ever knew how close it truly was. It didn't happen on stage. It didn't happen in a hotel room. It happened on a silent road, far from the lights, far from the applause, where there was no one to save him if something went wrong. Stay until the end, because this is not the story of an accident that happened. It's the story of an accident that almost happened, and the moment Elvis realized he might no longer be in control of his own body. The road was too empty for that hour. Elvis noticed it within the first few miles, but it didn't bother him. If anything, the quiet felt like relief. After hours of noise, voices, music, lights, expectations, the absence of sound was almost comforting. The engine hummed steadily. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness. Everything felt under control. Elvis held the steering wheel with relaxed confidence, the posture of a man who had driven this road countless times before. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't reckless. He was tired. That was far more dangerous. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. It lived behind his eyes, in the constant pressure of always having to deliver, always having to be present. The kind of fatigue that sleep never truly fixes, because it comes from repetition, not effort. The radio played softly in the background, familiar and easy to ignore. Elvis wasn't listening. His mind drifted back to the show that had just ended, small moments no one would notice. A step adjusted at the last second, a breath taken too shallow, a tightness in his chest he chose not to question. "You finished," he whispered to himself. "You're fine." He said it often, and often enough it worked. The road curved gently. Elvis blinked slowly, maybe a second too long. He shook his head, annoyed, refocusing his eyes on the asphalt ahead. "Stay sharp," he muttered. But the night offered no resistance. No passing cars. No flashing signs. No reason to stay alert. Monotony can be a betrayal. Elvis shifted in his seat, feeling an unfamiliar pressure in his chest. Not pain, just a strange tightness. He inhaled deeply. The air came in, but it didn't bring relief. "Just fatigue," he told himself again. Then it happened. Not dramatically. Not loudly. For a brief moment, maybe 2 seconds, the steering wheel felt delayed in his hands, as if the car hesitated to respond. The headlights caught something wrong ahead. Gravel. The edge of the road. Elvis corrected instinctively. Too hard. The car drifted toward the opposite side. The sound of the tires changed. The asphalt felt suddenly unreliable, like it could disappear at any second. Time slowed. He saw it clearly now. The dark drop beyond the road. The absence of barriers. The reality that nothing would stop the car if it crossed that line. His foot hovered over brake. He didn't slam it. Years of controlling pressure kicked in. He eased off the accelerator, hands steady despite the tremor running through his arms. His breathing went shallow, controlled. The car swayed. For one unbearable second, it felt unanchored, undecided. Then it corrected. The tires gripped the road again. The headlights aligned. The danger passed. Elvis slowed immediately and pulled over. He shut off the engine and sat in silence, hands still on the wheel, heart pounding hard enough to echo in his ears. He closed his eyes. Only then did he fully understand what had almost happened. If he had reacted a second later, if fatigue had pulled him deeper, if his body had failed just a little more, no one would have known. Elvis leaned forward until his forehead touched the steering wheel, breathing hard, forcing his body to calm. That night didn't end with a scare. It ended with a question he wasn't ready to answer. How many times could he escape like this? Elvis stayed in the car longer than he meant to. The engine was off. The headlights still cut through the darkness ahead. The road remained empty, indifferent, silent. For a moment, he considered starting the engine again and driving on as if nothing had happened. That had always been his instinct. Keep moving, don't linger, don't give fear time to grow roots. Turn the incident into a footnote, a scare, something that didn't deserve attention. He almost did it, but his body refused to cooperate. His hands were still trembling, not violently, but enough to be undeniable. His heartbeat hadn't settled into a normal rhythm. pounding too hard for a man sitting still. Elvis pressed his lips together and took a slow breath through his nose. Then another. The tightness in his chest lingered. That frightened him more than the near miss itself. He opened the door and stepped out of the car. The night air hit his face immediately, cold, sharp, grounding. He stood there for a second, one hand resting on the open door, listening. Nothing. No approaching cars. No wind strong enough to move the trees. No voices. Just a faint ticking sound of cooling metal. Elvis walked a few steps toward the edge of the road and looked beyond it. In the dim light of the headlights, he could make out the uneven drop, the suggestion of rocks and trees below. No guardrail. No forgiveness. He imagined the car leaving the road. The image was sudden and vivid, metal twisting, glass breaking, the sound swallowed by the night. No crowd. No help. No second take. That's when something shifted inside him. Not panic. Shame. Not because he had almost died, but because he knew deep down this hadn't been random. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't the road's fault. This was accumulated neglect. Elvis leaned back against the car, crossing his arms as a chill ran through him. How many nights had he pushed through exhaustion like this? How many times had he convinced himself that being tired was part of the job, that ignoring it was strength? Too many. He stared down the road again. It stretched forward calmly, offering no commentary, no judgment, just distance. The realization settled slowly. If the car had gone off the road, there would have been no one to blame but himself. No villain, no dramatic cause. Just a man who had asked too much of his body for too long. That truth was uncomfortable, because it meant the danger wasn't external. It was internal. Elvis returned to the driver's seat, but didn't start the car yet. He sat with his hands resting loosely on the wheel, eyes fixed on the dashboard, which now glowed faintly as he turned the key just enough to bring the lights on. The numbers were steady. Everything looked fine. That was the problem. Nothing had forced him to stop. No crash. No injury. No official reason to change anything. Just awareness. And awareness is easy to ignore. Elvis exhaled slowly and rested his forehead against the wheel again. He thought about how close he'd come to becoming another story people would analyze without ever understanding. Another headline stripped of context, but there would have been no headline. Not really. Just silence. That realization stayed with him as he finally started the engine again. He adjusted his seat slightly, repositioned his hands, and waited a few seconds before pulling back onto the road. This time he drove slower, not because he was afraid, but because he was listening. Every sensation felt amplified now. The way the steering wheel vibrated, the subtle pull of the road, his own breathing. Elvis was acutely aware of how much he had been operating on autopilot before. The road no longer felt neutral. It felt like a test. As he drove, fragments of past warnings surfaced, moments he'd brushed off, laughed away, medicated through, times when his body had spoken softly and been ignored. Tonight, it had raised its voice, and it unsettled him to realize that if he ignored this warning too, the next one might not give him a chance to pull over. The city lights eventually appeared in the distance, faint but reassuring. Civilization, structure, the illusion of safety returning. But something fundamental had changed. Elvis knew he would never see empty roads the same way again. They were no longer peaceful to him. They were honest, brutally so. By the time he reached home, he felt drained, not physically, but mentally, like something had been peeled back, leaving him exposed to a truth he couldn't unlearn. He shut off the car and sat there one last time, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. This night wasn't over. It had simply moved somewhere quieter. Elvis kept both hands on the wheel the rest of the way home. Not tightly, not nervously, deliberately. Every movement felt measured now, as if he were relearning a skill he had taken for granted. The road ahead was familiar, but his relationship to it had changed. It no longer felt like something to pass through on the way to somewhere else. It demanded presence. The radio stayed off. He didn't want distraction. He wanted to hear the car, the road, his own breathing. The quiet pressed in, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of thoughts that refused to be postponed. The image of the car drifting replayed in his mind, not as panic, but as analysis. He tried to isolate the exact second when control had slipped, not to punish himself, but to understand how close exhaustion had come to making a decision for him. That was the part that disturbed him most. He hadn't chosen danger. It had crept in quietly. Elvis realized how often he relied on momentum. Shows, schedules, expectations. Once things were moving, stopping felt impossible. The body became something to manage later, after the work was done, after the drive, after the next obligation. But the road didn't care about later. A dull ache settled between his shoulders, the kind that came from tension held too long. He rolled his neck slightly at a red light, then immediately stopped himself. Even small distractions felt risky now. He exhaled slowly, counting the breath out. His heartbeat had steadied, but the memory of how violently it had raced earlier stayed with him, like an echo. For the first time in a long while, Elvis wondered how many warnings he had missed simply because nothing dramatic followed them. How many nights ended safely enough to justify ignoring the signs? How many close calls never made themselves known? Survival, he realized, can be deceptive. It rewards denial. The closer he got to home, the more ordinary the world became. Streetlights, intersections, a passing car or two. Everything looked normal, which made the experience feel even more isolating. Because no one else knew. No one would ask how his drive was. No one would look at him and see how close something irreversible had come to happening. From the outside, this night would dissolve into routine. Inside him, it was anything but routine. Elvis slowed as he turned onto a familiar street, the tires humming softly. The sense of danger had passed, but it left behind something heavier, responsibility. Not to the public, not to a schedule, to himself. He parked and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, eyes unfocused. The house ahead looked calm, unchanged, as if it had been waiting patiently for him to return exactly as he always had. He wasn't sure he had. When he finally stepped inside, the stillness of the rooms felt louder than the road ever had. He moved through the space quietly, instinctively, as if he might wake something if he wasn't careful. Sleep didn't come easily. When he laid down, his body felt tired but alert, like it hadn't decided whether the danger was truly over. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence, replaying the moment when instinct had taken over and saved him. This time, that word lingered. This time, Elvis understood then that the road hadn't been a fluke. It had been a convergence of fatigue, pressure, and years of pushing past limits without consequence. Or so he thought. Consequences don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they wait until you're alone. As sleep finally pulled him under, it wasn't rest he felt. It was suspension, like something unresolved had followed him home and taken a seat nearby, waiting for morning. Elvis woke up expecting relief. That familiar reset he had relied on for years, the kind where sleep blurred the edges of a hard night and returned things to something manageable. He lay still for a moment, eyes closed, waiting for the body to tell him everything was fine. It didn't. The heaviness was there immediately. Not pain, not panic, just a quiet, stubborn presence in his chest, like a reminder that hadn't gone to bed with him. He opened his eyes slowly. Morning light slipped through the curtains, soft and ordinary. Birds somewhere outside. Distant movement. The world looked exactly the way it always had after a late night. That made it worse, because nothing on the outside reflected how close he had come to not waking up at all. Elvis sat up carefully, feet touching the floor one at a time. He waited. No dizziness, no sharp warning. But the sensation remained, that wrongness that didn't demand attention, yet refused to disappear. In the bathroom mirror, he studied his reflection longer than usual. He looked tired, yes, but he always looked tired. There was nothing dramatic to justify fear. No visible reason to slow down. That was the danger. If there had been pain, he could have reacted. If there had been collapse, someone else would have stepped in. Instead, there was only awareness, and awareness requires choice. He turned away from the mirror and moved through the morning quietly. Coffee tasted dull. Food held no interest. He found himself moving more deliberately than usual, as if his body had asked for permission before each step. The road came back to him in fragments, not as terror as clarity. The second when the car hesitated, the edge of the pavement, the realization that no one would have been there to help. Elvis sat down, elbows resting on his knees, staring at nothing. For years, he had treated exhaustion like a badge of honor, proof that he was giving everything, proof that he was still needed. But the road didn't care about dedication. It responded only to physics. And so did his body. The thought landed harder than anything else. If I ignore this, the next warning might not give me time to pull over. That scared him. Not because he wanted to live forever, but because he wasn't ready to leave this way. Quietly, meaninglessly, alone on a stretch of road that wouldn't even remember his name. He realized then that the danger wasn't behind him. It was ahead if nothing changed. Elvis leaned back and closed his eyes, breathing slowly, deliberately. He wasn't making plans yet. He wasn't calling anyone. He wasn't announcing anything. But denial was no longer available to him. The night had followed him into daylight, and it wasn't going anywhere. By midday, Elvis understood something that unsettled him more than the night itself. Nothing was going to force his hand. There would be no doctor bursting in with urgent orders, no manager calling to cancel commitments, no visible collapse to justify a pause. From the outside, he still looked capable, functional, reliable, which meant the decision was his alone. That realization sat heavy. For most of his life, change had come from pressure, contracts, schedules, expectations stacked by people who assumed he would always find a way to endure. Even concern usually arrived only after something broke publicly. This time, nothing had broken. That made it easier to ignore and harder to respect. Elvis moved through the day with a heightened awareness that bordered on restraint. He noticed how often he'd usually rush from room to room, thought to thought, and how automatic that pace had become. Slowing down felt unnatural, almost wrong, like he was breaking an unspoken rule. He thought about calling someone, anyone, not to confess, not to dramatize, just to say, something scared me last night. But the words never formed fully, because saying them would make the warning real, in a way silence didn't. Elvis sat alone, hands clasped, staring at the floor. He thought about the people who depended on him, about the machine built around his availability, about how many lives moved according to whether he showed up or not. And then, reluctantly, he asked himself a question he had avoided for years. What happens if I don't? The answer wasn't catastrophic, and that was a problem. The world wouldn't end. Schedules would adjust. Someone would fill the space temporarily. The illusion of indispensability dissolved under scrutiny. What wouldn't adjust was his body. The road had shown him that clearly. Elvis realized he had been treating survival as something passive, something that just happened as long as he kept going. But survival, he now understood, was active. It required decisions made before disaster, not after. He stood and walked to a window, looking out without really seeing. The day felt normal, too normal, and that normalcy tempted him to dismiss everything as overthinking. He almost did, but then the image returned, not the car drifting, but the moment just after, when his hands wouldn't stop shaking, when his heart refused to calm, when the silence had felt accusatory rather than peaceful. That wasn't imagination. That was data. Elvis exhaled slowly. He didn't need to change everything at once. He didn't need grand declarations. He just needed to stop pretending the warning hadn't been meant for him. That, he realized, was the hardest part, because listening meant accepting limits, and limits had never been part of his identity. But maybe they needed to be. By the end of the day, nothing dramatic had happened, and yet everything felt different. Elvis sat quietly as evening settled in, the house dimming naturally around him. He thought about the countless nights he had pushed through fatigue, telling himself that tomorrow would be easier. That rest could wait. Tomorrow had finally arrived, and it wasn't easier, but it was honest. He understood now that the night on the road hadn't been about almost dying. It had been about almost continuing without awareness, about how close he had come to letting exhaustion decide something irreversible for him. The road hadn't tried to kill him. It had warned him. And warnings don't repeat forever. Elvis didn't know what changes would come next. He didn't map out a future or make promises he couldn't keep. He simply acknowledged the truth he had been avoiding. He couldn't keep living as if endurance was infinite. That realization didn't weaken him. It steadied him. For the first time in a long while, Elvis allowed himself to imagine a version of strength that didn't depend on pushing past pain, but on recognizing it early enough to stop. The night remained private, unrecorded, untold, but it stayed with him as a quiet line he would never cross again. Because sometimes survival isn't about escaping death. Sometimes it's about finally choosing to listen while you still have time.